Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Bible Ponder for today. We talked a bit last week about the idea of word studies, that is, looking back at the ancient languages that the Bible was written in to try and better understand what the authors were trying to convey in the language that they used and in the way that they wrote. Sometimes words just translate kind of one for one. We have a word for something like an apple, and other languages and cultures throughout history have also had words for something like an apple or a fig or a horse or things like that. And maybe they were slightly different in terms of the kind of animals or fruits they included, but generally there are words that are kind of a one for one swap. But there are also some words that we don't have good translations for in some of our languages, or especially English, as is the main language we're talking about here. Sometimes there are words in ancient Hebrew or Greek that mean something in that language, but it's hard to have a word that kind of swaps one for that word. And so I talked about how word studies can be really helpful at illuminating an author's meaning and kind of what they are trying to convey, but at the same time, sometimes those word studies can be overblown or maybe a bit too far, trying to look at the biblical text as if it's some sort of secret code that needs to be deciphered and that we're looking behind every nook and cranny for hidden meaning. The writers of the Bible did not hide meaning necessarily, they just used the languages that they spoke. And sometimes those languages don't necessarily translate one for one with a modern language like English. Also, sometimes words in our translations go through a couple layers of translation in order to get to the meaning of a word that we use in English. And so what I wanted to do today is do a bit of an example of a kind of short study of a word that is a good example of why a word study can be helpful, and something that shows us kind of how you can gain a lot of meaning and grow in your understanding of the Bible and biblical theology through studying the ancient languages. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to look at the word that's often translated as mercy in the Bible. It's used a lot, and it is a Hebrew word that is a fun one to pronounce. So Hebrew has quite a strong H sort of letter, and so this word is chesed. And sometimes we might see it just as Chesed, or maybe spelled in English with a CH, like Chesed. And maybe as people who speak sort of Scots or Doric, you might be better at that sort of CH. It's almost like the CH in Loch. It's kind of got that guttural sort of sound. And I'm not the best at a lot of sounds, but that's my attempt at this word. So Chesed is used a lot in the Bible, and it's translated in the King James Bible, especially mostly as mercy. So we might, on the surface as we're reading, think mercy. And what do we think of with mercy in English? We maybe think of a judge sort of showing mercy on someone who is needing to be punished, or maybe, it's again that kind of leniency we think about. But that's not what chesed is. It's got a kind of more robust thing. If there's not a good one-for-one translation. So here's where those layers of translation come in. Is Chesed is translated in the Greek version of the Old Testament, which was translated before the New Testament was written by a group of scholars in Egypt, and they translated all of the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew into Greek to make it more readable for people. That story is familiar to us. We know how that goes. In the Greek version of the Old Testament, when they translated that word chesed often with the Greek word for mercy. And so then when that gets translated again and you translated it into Latin or then updated into English, and you're also looking at the Greek version of the Old Testament, you might look at that word and how it's translated as mercy into Greek. And then you go, okay, we'll go mercy. But chesed has a much deeper and richer meaning than that. In more modern translations than the King James Bible, you do get it translated in somewhat different ways. And even in the King James, it's translated quite a few different ways. So even if we are to look here at a sort of entry for the word chesed, we can see that it's translated as mercy in the King James 149 times out of the 248 times that it is used. Then it's also translated kindness is the next most common at 40. So you have mercy, you have kindness, and then you have a word that was actually made up to translate this thing, and that's loving kindness. And that is 30 times used. So it's a combination word, loving kindness. Then you have goodness, kindly, merciful, favor, good, all sorts of different ways that the writers of a translation have tried to communicate the meaning of this word. It's a word that has a lot of love in it. It has that kindness, it has that mercy, but it also has something deeper and richer in the way that it's used. So we go from just a direct sort of translation to looking at context. There's a few verses specifically that show us that that word chesed has more than just a general affection. It's also got some like zeal behind it, love. Again, loving kindness is maybe a good way to get at it. It's something that's active and full of love, but it is also to do with God's covenant with God's people. So we see the word chesed show up in verses that are also tied in with the word for covenant, and especially about God's relationship to Israel. So we see it in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9, and this is a really important verse. The NIV translates it this way. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, or that Yahweh your God is God. Sorry about that. We'll try again. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9 in the NIV translates it this way. Know therefore that Yahweh your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. So you have covenant of love is the way that they've translated this, when a more literal translation is probably, know therefore that only Yahweh your God is God, the steadfast God who keeps his covenant and chesed faithfully to the 1,000th generation of those who love him and keep his commandments. So it is his covenant and his chesed. So he keeps both of them. So it is tied in with the covenant. It's also, you see it in Psalm 25, for the mountains may move and the hills be shaken, but my chesed shall never move from you, nor my covenant of friendship be shaken, said Yahweh, who takes you back in love. And then in Psalm 25, that was Isaiah 54, sorry, and then in Psalm 25, all Yahweh's paths are chesed and truth for those who keep the decrees of his covenant. So there's an idea of covenant tied in with this idea of loving kindness, mercy, love, all of this sort of wrapped up in together. But it's God's chesed for us. So we can have that chesed for each other a bit, but mostly in the Bible, the way it's used is talking about God towards us, this idea of God's loving kindness to God's people, to God's covenant people specifically. And it's even tied in with David's covenant. In other parts of Isaiah, we see this word tied in with the idea of being true to God's covenant that God made with David. So this idea isn't just, as we would think of again, as just the word mercy. There's something deep and rich about this idea of loving kindness. It's full of fervor and zeal, but it's also got a hint of mercy in it, but it's also got love and kindness and good deeds and faithfulness to it. So that is not fully captured by our English word mercy. And so a word study of something like chesed can be helpful for us. It can be illuminating. It can kind of lift out of the text some more deeper and richer meaning. that can help us understand God more, can help us understand the world we're living in more. And so that's an example, one quick example of a good word study, of something that I think is helpful for us and that is something that makes the Bible richer and doesn't lead us down some interesting thing, but it's also not looking at the biblical text for some kind of secret code. Do you see the slight difference there? We're just looking at a word and seeing how it's used in that language. It's sort of natural usage. We're not trying to invent some meaning or fill it with different sort of secret hidden agenda. It's just the word that they used when they wrote, and it meant what it meant to them. And in our language, we just don't have a word that means quite the same thing. So we have to use a few different words or even invent a new word like loving kindness to try and get at that meaning. But sometimes you have to just look at how that word was used in its language to really fully understand how that goes. And I think one of the things that can be quite helpful for some of us is there are, in understanding this, is I think there are a lot of words used in sort of Scottish culture, either in Scots dialects and in or even in Doric, where there isn't quite a perfect word for word translation between the word that is used and the English word. So a good example of a word that's really common, one of the first words I think a lot of people who move here learn is dreich, and that sort of dark and dank and wet and dreary sort of weather. See, again, I used multiple English words to try and get at that one word that captures an idea really well and clearly in one word. It's not some hidden code. It's just a word that's used that doesn't quite have the same sort of cognate in English. So you see how this works, and it's the same with when we translate the Bible. So I hope that's a helpful kind of word study. I hope even not just seeing the word study itself, but that word specifically of loving kindness, of Chesed, of seeing how much richer and fuller God's love and mercy is for us. So thanks for joining us, and I hope that you have a good week. Bye-bye.